Okay, so now I'm going to talk about interviewing. And interviewing is so freaking hard. You probably will not believe this, but I promise it is true. Our show rate for interviews is around 50%, if not less. And when I tell people that, they never believe me. And that's because it doesn't make sense. Like, why would someone go through the trouble of submitting a resume, getting an email back from the recruiter, then booking a call, and then just not show up? I don't know. It's baffling to me too. But you have to know that that is the show rate. So when you're going through resumes, that's why I suggested earlier that you don't want to just pick your favorite resumes out and interview those few people because you're setting yourself up for disappointment. You have to pick a bunch of resumes and book a set of interviews because at the end of the day, the show rates are often so low that this becomes a numbers game. So in this section of the course, I'm going to go over the best way to structure your interviews. And in the packet, we'll have an outline structure as well as some good interview questions. So let's start with the interview structure. So in the interview, you want to start off by introducing yourself and the company, and then also give a brief overview of the actual role, specifically the day-to-day. And you should write this piece down and give the same explanation each time that you conduct an interview. And try to mention things that were not in the job description that was written online, because they should have already read that over. They should already know that like the back of their hand. So then when you open the floor up to ask any questions, make sure you do that before the interview actually begins. So after you give your introduction, before you start interviewing. And I see a lot of recommendations to push the candidate questions to the back of the interview, but you actually want to start with questions in the front half of the interview. And I answer all questions at the beginning because it's a good measure of how succinct and aware they are. So if someone spends 15 minutes asking questions, it's going to be eating into their interview time. And sometimes interviews run long, and you want to make sure that a candidate has time to ask questions, so you do want to put that at the front and try to front load that. And even more so, sometimes your answer to a question might be a deal breaker for them, and so they'll opt to leave the interview early. So that just saves everybody's time. And so next, you want to set the stage that you are going to ask some questions. So before you begin, just state that you're going to be asking some interview questions, and then tell them the exact number of questions that you are going to ask so that they can pace themselves as well. Someone is going to answer differently if you're only asking 3 questions versus 20. And I have found that 7 interview questions tends to be ideal. 8 can work as well. And now, I say this candidly, just like I had said not to use ChatGPT to write your job description, don't have it write your interview questions either. And I'll tell you why. I don't know why ChatGPT does this, but they create 2-part questions when you ask them to write down interview questions for you. And 2-part questions are traditionally awful interview questions. Interviews are stressful. And if you ask 2-part questions, most of the time, people only answer 1/2 of the question because they're in a stress environment, they're nervous, and their brain is just picking up the most important pieces that you're asking. And I don't think that that's actually an indication if someone is a good candidate or a bad one. So just stick to 1-part questions. And it's not hard to write good interview questions. They just need to be original. And I see a lot of people Google good interview questions. But just like you Googled good interview questions, your candidate Googled the best answers to the most common interview questions. So you're not really getting good answers when you're just reading off the most common interview questions. You're getting a regurgitated TikTok answer rooted in pseudopsychology. And honestly, that sucks. So let's skip that process and just go the original route. Okay, so in this portion, I'm gonna actually talk about the specific interview questions that you can ask. So my first favorite thing to do is start with a scenario. And I would create a scenario that requires some critical thinking. For example, of a favorite scenario of mine. is your boss is supposed to fly out of France on Wednesday, but all of the planes have been grounded due to a strike until Friday. She has an event in the United States on Thursday, so she definitely has to be back by then. What would you do? And the correct answer is taking a train to a nearby city. But this question shows not only creative problem solving, but the ability to overcome an obstacle and think on your feet. Second, in your own words, can you tell me about what you think your day-to-day would look like if you were to get this position? And I love this question because this tells me how much research someone did on the role and the company. And if someone wants the job, they'll research it. This is also a reflection on how much work that they'll put into assigned tasks once they're actually on the job and hired. And if you're taking multiple interviews and multiple people are getting this question wrong, then you might need to do a better job of making the job description and company offering a little bit more clear. Third, why did you apply for this position? It's a simple question, but I love it. And because it allows people to go one of two ways. They can either talk about how they hate their current job, or they can talk about why they were excited for this one. And you wouldn't think people would talk about how much they hate their job, but it happens a lot. And it's a clear glimpse into their tact and understanding of social situations. And it's also a clear way to gauge about how passionate they are about the position that they're applying for. 4, can you give me an example of a time that you solved a problem before it became a larger issue? And I love this question because it shows the type of employee that they are. Is their idea of problem solving just part of a basic expectation of the job, or are they actually going above and beyond? A common bad answer I get to this question is spotting an error on a report. And to me, at least, that's just part of the basic completion of your job description. And that's why they have someone checking your reports over, because you're supposed to catch mistakes. Versus, I was interviewing someone for an executive assistant position once, and she was working as a travel agent at the time when I asked her this question. And she told me an absolutely wild story. She had a client miss a flight, and the guy was extremely upset. He called her and he was crying, right? It was like a really sad situation. And so she tried calling the airline, but the airline wasn't picking up, wasn't answering, she couldn't get through. So instead of waiting for the airline to call her back, she actually drove to the airport near her to talk directly to a gate agent. And they ended up getting the guy rebooked on the last flight going out that day. And I hired her. She's great. And the thing is, she consistently goes above and beyond. 5, how do you stay organized? And when you're interviewing someone, you want to get a sneak peek into their brain. And this question definitely does that. If someone does not have a task organization system, they're probably going to miss half the stuff you tell them to do. Or you're going to constantly have to remind them. And the most interesting answer I have ever gotten for this question was someone who actually asked if they could screen share with me when I asked this question. And they showed me how they had built a custom Asana profile and how they optimized everything in their lives on Asana. And that was everything from their grocery list to when their kid had important tests or quizzes to last minute tasks at work that they had to assign and complete. Number 6, what would you like to do in your free time? Tell me a little bit about yourself as a person. And this is a self-explanatory question, but you really need to figure out if someone is a culture fit. It's super important, and I actually don't know why that's not listed as a commonly suggested interview question. There are also certain jobs that you might want someone more introverted versus someone who's more extroverted to do. I made this mistake hiring a few years ago. I had to fill a job for a position that required somebody to work weekends. And during the interview process, I asked the first candidate what he liked to do in his free time. His answer was that he liked to hang out with his friends, and play soccer. And we ended up hiring him because he was incredibly qualified, but he quit within the first month. And it's because he didn't really want to work on the weekends. And when he gave a little bit of insight into himself, I should have seen that it wasn't a fit. So now that's always something I don't ignore. We always really try to do personality fits, and you should too. And so for the next hire, we got someone who said that he liked to woodwork and play video games in his free time. And he was a way better culture fit for the position. And he's actually still working for that same company. I hope those 6 questions were useful and that can be used as a base. But I've actually included extra questions. And in the packet, there's a list of 15 interview questions and a step-by-step guide on why the psychology behind each question actually makes the question useful. And if you really cannot think of any interview questions, these are really good ones to ask. But I would highly recommend just giving a scenario that comes up every day in your job, and I would ask how they would solve it. You can't expect them to solve the problem exactly how you would, but you can expect them to give a process, which will provide a lot of insight. Hiring is hard. You can find the perfect candidate, and it might not be a fit for a completely unexpected reason. For example, I had hired a receptionist for a company once, and they loved her. Day one, they were calling us, telling us how much they loved her, how excited they were. And she was born and raised in the same area, so she was familiar with the region, and she had a lot of experience in the field, great references, easy to talk to. But just 2 days into the job, she quit completely out of the blue and didn't tell us why. So we ended up staffing someone else that was not a first choice. But she's still in the role, she still loves it, and the company couldn't be happier. Sometimes hiring doesn't work out, and there's no reason to it. But hopefully this packet and video will provide some insight so you can get started in the right direction, but it is not an exact science. My best advice is just to be patient.